Our story begins on a typically lukewarm and rainy London afternoon, and I have a fantasy football draft that I need to prepare for. At this point, I'd done a bit of background watching and reading on sleepers, good value picks, etc. in order to prepare. Like most years, though, I don't feel particularly prepared. Every guy on YouTube seemed to just be opinionated with a thin veneer of objectivity. Some had plausible sounding arguments based on training camp reports, snap shares, yada yada yada, while others appealed to the sacred bro knowledge. Truisms like, he's got that dog in him, and don't trust the Jets, they suck. I came away from it all not knowing who to trust. It was basically the same as chatting to your buddy's suspect home friend at the bar, who gets his football takes from Dave Portnoy and his vaccine advice from Joe Rogan. That year I wanted to look into the numbers myself for a change. So, I downloaded the prior year's fantasy football stats to see if I could discern any overlooked patterns. The idea is that to truly see which players were the best, it was a lot more about relative value in the lineup versus the opponent's player in that position. The analysis was simple. Sort players by how many more points they scored than the worst starting player at their position. This analysis attempted to measure a metric that is familiar to any baseball fan: points above replacement. I'll explain this in more depth later in the video. When I'd finished the spreadsheet and ensured it was fit for even the most hardo of ICs, I was astonished by the results. It felt like I had really discovered something special, something that would change the course of fantasy football drafting strategy. The best points above replacement performers in 2022 included many of the usual suspects, whose names strike fear in the overburdened hearts of beer-bellied men nationwide. Justin Jefferson was in first, Austin Eckler in second, Josh Jacobs in third, and Derrick Henry in fifth. No surprises there. But the list included some names that no so-called fantasy football expert would ever tell you to draft in the first round. Travis Kelce was in fourth, Patrick Mahomes in sixth, Josh Allen in seventh, and Jalen Hurts in ninth. The top 10 list had far more quarterbacks and tight ends than I was expecting. For those who don't know, fantasy football has a well-established conventional wisdom. To win, you need an elite running back or two and elite wide receivers. The logic goes that there are plenty of quarterbacks to pick from that aren't much better than each other in terms of points, so you should wait until later rounds to go for one. Only degen noobs take a quarterback in the early rounds. Maybe you grab an elite tight end like Travis Kelce in the second or third round if you're feeling frisky, but otherwise don't even bother until a later round. For that year's draft, the running backs and receivers in consideration for a first-round pick looked a bit risky, but Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes seemed set to take their MAGA wives to another Super Bowl. I had the first overall pick in that night's draft, and I knew what I had to do. I knew that I had to pick Travis Kelce first overall, because it was basically guaranteed to be high value, even if my fraternity brothers thought it was dumb. I was okay with that, since I thought I had found a massive edge. As I clicked to confirm my selection, the group chat was predictably full of chirps. "Reach!" they typed jeerfully. I was cautiously cocky, knowing that none of them knew what I did. The jeers came in a bit more when I took Patrick Mahomes at the end of the second round. I looked like a total noob, but at the end of the season, I'd be the one laughing, because I had the absolute sack of a stack, ready to terrorize the league like Prime Bin Laden. At least, that's what I thought. It ended up being a bit silly, after all. You see, while that may have been the optimal pick of the year prior, or a good one at the very least, sports tend to do this thing where performance changes year to year. Both Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes had relatively downed years compared to 2022. Travis's points above replacement went from 148 to 63, which was still very good, but kind of bad for a first overall pick. While Mahomes' fall was even further. He went from 145 points above replacement to 24. Pretty mid. Despite some savvy picks in later rounds like Breece Hall and David Montgomery, my team was bounced in the first round of the playoffs yet again. Like Lehman Brothers in '08, I'd failed to price in risk. Drafting is risky at the end of the day, and everyone who's ever played fantasy football knows it's a crapshoot. My strategy counted on the Chiefs repeating their performance from the prior year. Still, I left that season feeling like I was onto something. What if I was right about my idea that elite quarterbacks and tight ends are undervalued, but I just executed it poorly. In today's video, I wanted to try and tackle the question of positional value in fantasy football once and for all, using my trademark combination of data, optimization strategies, with a touch of Connecticut elitism. Am I onto something, or are the experts mostly right on this topic? And where can we gain an advantage over the casuals? Next up, the scope of work. In phase 1, we will create a measurement for evaluating the relative value of NFL players' season-long performance that accounts for structural differences by position. For example, the number of roster spots at that position, the position's depth, etc., and their subsequent return on draft capital. We will then qualitatively assess and refine the viability of this framework in assessing fantasy football positional value. In phase 2, we will use the developed framework to assess historical draft success by player position and draft position. In phase 3, we will tie it all together to identify key positional value conclusions and draft strategies for aspiring players to leverage, including under and overvalued positions and optimal draft strategies. For this video, I have assumed that we are playing in a 12-team league with half PPR scoring and standard rosters. For the data, I have used Fantasy Pro's average ADP across all fantasy football websites and their scoring data. To start out, it would be useful to elaborate a little bit on why positional value matters in fantasy football. In short, it all comes down to two factors. One, that only one team per league can select a given player, and two, that you can only start 10 players each game. This concept is made increasingly relevant due to structural differences between different positions. In a standard league, you pick one quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, one tight end, a defense, a kicker, and one flex, which is typically another running back or wide receiver, to start each week, which limits the amount of players that you can put out there. Let's look at a case study. On the screen is a box score of a pivotal matchup between myself and the Riley Reid option. As is often the case with Riley Reid, it was tight, but I came out on top. When we break down the scoring by position, it becomes clear that our running backs, wide receivers, defenses, and kickers were basically a wash. The clear difference makers in this matchup was our lone quarterback and flex. This is of course a random example, and of course in other box scores, teams will win because of great running back or wide receiver performances relative to their opponent. But it does suggest that over the course of the season, you ideally want players that consistently outscore the opponent's players at that position. As you can see in this example, with the positions with much more limited spots, it's less about the total points you score and more about how much you outscore the opponent. With that out of the way, we can return to the concept of points above replacement. This metric is necessary to assess how valuable a player is in fantasy football because some positions tend to score more or less points than each other, and some have more or fewer starting spots each week. To account for these differences, the definition of replacement level varies by position, in line with how many roster spots each position has on a team. For quarterbacks, tight ends, defenses, and kickers, I've defined replacement level as the 12th best player at each position, assuming each of these positions gets one lineup spot and it's a 12-team league. For running backs and wide receivers, the replacement level is the 30th best, to account for their two roster spots each week and the fact that they can also be played at the flex position. Here's an example of this concept in practice. Last year, Lamar Jackson scored the most fantasy points outright at 382, while the best running back was Saquon Barkley at 321 points. Seems like Lamar was more valuable, right? Wrong, because we haven't factored in scoring quirks and depth at the position. Quarterbacks tend to score a lot more points than running backs. In 2024, a replacement level quarterback scored 247 points, while a replacement level running back scored 136. So when you calculate points above replacement, factoring this in, Saquon comes out on top at 185 points above replacement versus 135 for Lamar. Now we need to put this PAR theory to the test. Is it woke nonsense or stroke of genius from this Yankee libtard? Here you can see some of the best PAR seasons over the last 4 years. They seem to check out for the most part. Although it's mostly running backs and receivers that have broken the 100 PAR barrier, there do seem to be more quarterbacks and tight ends than one might expect, including the 2022 version of Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes. So far, this metric does seem to accurately measure how good a fantasy football season was, and it suggests that the conventional wisdom that running backs and wide receivers are the most important is mostly true. Let's take a look at the last 4 seasons to see if there's any obvious positional trends. This spreadsheet is comparing the average point total of the top 3 in each position to the performance of the replacement level player at that position that season.
This once again seems to suggest that the conventional wisdom is correct. The best performing running backs outperform the replacement level ones by the most, then wide receivers, then quarterbacks, then tight ends, and kickers and defenses are basically an afterthought. That said, kickers have experienced robust growth from 2021 to 2024, only rivaled by slot bowl manufacturers, crypto scams, and fascism. Maybe I'll need to update the video in the next few years. Anyway, the data seems pretty clear, right? Running backs and wide receivers are clearly the most important to draft. Well, not so fast. It's all well and good to look at the end of the season in hindsight, but on draft night we need to actually be able to predict who the best players will be. The unfortunate reality of fantasy football is that for every Saquon Barkley hitting like prime Johnny Sins at the end of the first round, there's a Christian McCaffrey, the consensus first overall pick in 2024, who basically missed the entire season due to injury. Anybody who plays fantasy football will know this intuitively. Running backs and wide receivers have the highest upside, but also a lot more risk. For our framework to be viable, it needs to price in the probability of a player busting. Pause. Just how likely is your pick to hit if you choose a running back versus a quarterback versus a wide receiver versus a tight end? This is where our story gets interesting. In order to measure success, we need some way of pricing in the probability that a given player at a given position will be good, depending on where they got drafted. This is a bit arbitrary, I will admit, but it seems to me that PARs above 100 are clearly elite. These are the best fantasy seasons of the last 4 years, as we saw earlier. I've called these seasons the league winning tier. Next is the stud tier, which is between 50 and 99 PAR. You're very happy with these players, but they don't single-handedly win you the league like the league winners do. Then you have solid players between 25 and 49 PAR, aka the Jerry Judys and Zay Flowers of the world. The last category is mid, between 0 and 25 points above replacement. Last year, it included behemoths of middery, like Calvin Ridley and Brian Robinson Jr. You might flex them here and there, but you're not happy about it either.
Now that I've explained what the tiers mean, let's take a high-level look at your likelihood of success getting a league winner or stud by position. This table shows the percentage of players taking the first 100 picks of fantasy drafts by their PAR tier and position, and the results are very interesting. The first thing that jumps out at you is that you are basically equally likely to get a league-winning or stud quarterback as you are running back in the first 100 picks. I was also surprised to see that wide receivers have much lower hit rates than running backs, as I always thought that wide receivers were a relatively safe bet versus other positions. However, this is a very high-level analysis. After all, way more running backs and receivers are typically taken in drafts, so that's probably skewing the numbers quite a bit. Let's look round by round. When we break down the analysis for each round of the draft, the picture gets even more intriguing, as the distribution is quite different for each position. For instance, you can see here that the wide receiver hit rate is relatively high in the early rounds, then falls off a cliff later on. Running back looks like a total crapshoot no matter where you draft them, but you also have a decent chance of finding a stud pretty much anywhere. The analysis also seems to suggest that taking a quarterback early gives you a very high chance of getting a stud or league winner. Lastly, if you exclude prime Travis Kelce, premium tight ends tend to only rival other positions' ROI in rounds 4 to 6, aka the George Kittle zone. This analysis, measuring the percent of studs and league winners, etc., is basically as far as the fantasy football analysts tend to go. But it's still a bit too surface level for my liking, since we're not really capturing the actual expected outcome here. I want to know what I should expect to happen on average if I take a wide receiver in the first round instead of a running back, for instance. Well, don't worry, because I am my own quant. I give you average PAR plus by round of position. What is PAR plus, you ask? Well, it's a slightly superior indicator of optimal macro strategy. All it is taking a weighted average of a player taken in each round's PAR, but treating any bust that performed below replacement, like Christian McCaffrey last year, as 0 instead of a negative value. After all, it's not like you have to play Christian McCaffrey each week. If he's terrible or injured, you just got nothing from your investment. This table suggests something more nuanced than what we've looked at so far. When you properly weigh busts and studs alike, receivers come out as the best round 1 picks on paper, closely followed by running backs. Once again, you can pretty clearly see that wide receiver value drops off a lot faster than running back value, suggesting that it might be better to spend a first round pick on a wide receiver and your second round pick on a running back in a vacuum.
Again, the data seems to suggest that elite level quarterbacks might be some of the best selections you can make in round 3 and beyond. Once again, tight ends tend to rival other positions in PAR plus, starting in rounds 4 to 5. Okay, well that's all well and good, CT Consultant, but the draft order changes each year, depending on each player's situation. A lot of the time, a quarterback or tight end will go in round 3 because we know they're going to be really good, but we can't apply that to every year. Also, each platform has totally different recommended drafting cues, so you can't universally apply these findings. Well, made up skeptical viewer, I think that's a valid point. Let's do this analysis again, except we sort the data by the order they're being taken in their position. Are they the RB1 off the board, or the RB30? This should give us a good indication of how applicable our findings are and allow you to adapt more dynamically during your actual drafts. First, I want to present a high-level whiff rate table as a starting point. This one aims to answer the question, if I take a top 3, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, etc. off the board, how likely am I to totally whiff on that? I've broken down the tiers of players as follows, based on my rough sense of where the tier breaks usually are. At the elite end are the top 3 of a given position in terms of ADP. These are the guys that all the experts are telling you to take going into the season with no hesitation. Then you have the high-end ones, taken 4 to 6 at their position, then the low-end ones, taken 7 through 12th at their position, and then as we get into the high-end and low-end 2s, 3s, and 4s, the tiers are the next 6 players in terms of ADP at their position. For example, low-end 2s are positions 18th through 24th. A whiff here is defined as a player that is below replacement. As you can see, the results seem to be more in line with what intuition seems to tell us. Running backs are the most risky, and receivers are the least. But, yet again, we see the same pattern. Wide receiver whiff rates really accelerate as you get further down the draft, while running back risk plateaus a bit. QBs are very safe for the elite guys, then pretty risky if you miss out on the top 3 or so. It's a similar story with tight ends, especially when you exclude Travis Kelce. Finally, I'm going to show you guys the last chart that I think really sums up our findings today. It is the weighted PAR plus by player ADP tier. The data seems to suggest that picking a consensus top 3 wide receiver, running back, or quarterback will yield you roughly the same amount of points above replacement on average, factoring in busts. The key difference here is that you can get an elite quarterback in round 3, but you cannot get elite wide receivers or running backs in that round. For running backs, there's plenty of value to be had outside the top 3, but for wide receivers and quarterbacks, it drops off a lot faster. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of draft strategy, let's first recap what we've learned about each position so far. First, let's start with running backs. We all knew going into this video that if you hit on your running backs, you're going to have a great chance to win your league. They're clearly the highest upside position in fantasy football. We also learned that running backs have a lot more depth in drafts than we often give them credit for, meaning that the chance you hit on a steal later in drafts is a lot higher than you'd think. Next, let's talk about quarterbacks. We now know that they are almost as capable of being league winners as running backs, as Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes have demonstrated in recent years. They are also a risk-averse player's dream. Like me when I've had a few too many nose beers, they almost never bust. However, if you miss out on the elite tier, their value drops off a cliff. This suggests that you should absolutely prioritize getting an elite quarterback in future fantasy football drafts. Wide receivers have surprised me the most. After the elite and high-end wide receiver ones, their expected value drops off pretty fast in almost every metric we've looked at so far. After these more premium tiers, you're left with a bunch of players that only perform a bit better than replacement on average. On reflection, this kind of makes sense to me. I've always rostered a bunch of mid-wide receivers, started 1 to 2 of them based on matchup, and it's been mostly fine. Receivers are just inherently harder to project than running back at the end of the day, especially in half PPR formats. If you're the starting running back on a good offense, your volume is basically guaranteed. But even quote-unquote alpha wide receiver ones might have to deal with the possibility of bad quarterback play, double teams, defensive schemes designed to shut them down, and game scripts that favor the run, among other inconsistencies. There's a reason that there isn't really a running back equivalent of Devontae Smith, Jameson Williams, or Rashid Shaheed. The analysis on tight ends also surprised me. Most fantasy football experts talk about elite tight ends and elite quarterbacks as if they're roughly equivalent, when they're really not. The expected value of elite tight ends isn't all that great to begin with, and then it becomes a total crapshoot pretty quickly once you pass George Kittle. I fear we've all been chasing the high of owning prime Travis Kelce, but I think elite tight ends are now overrated as a result. Last, and definitely least, are the kickers and defenses.
They're basically not worth considering at all until the last 2 rounds, unless the kicking revolution continues to climb to unprecedented heights. Now, it's time to use what we've learned to craft a dynamic, theoretically optimal draft strategy that we can use going forward. As we learned earlier in the video, the data suggests it's probably best to pick up elite wide receivers in the first round, then a high-end running back, then get an elite quarterback, then take shots on a bunch of running backs and wide receivers. However, it's crucial to go into draft day knowing your league mates. If you're confident everyone's going to pick a running back in round 1 and you have a later pick, maybe it's best to pick up 2 elite wide receivers and then take shots on running backs a bit later. In a different draft where your league mates get bricked up for elite wide receivers, there's a world where doubling up on running back in the first 2 rounds is optimal instead. The point is that the best draft strategy requires you understanding the value of each player by position and their ADP tier and adapting to your draft in real time. Now I'm going to present maybe the coolest chart of the video so far, a representation of the average draft from 2020 to 2024 by player ADP tier. It shows the average PAR plus of the best player available at each pick in the average draft over the last 4 years. I've grouped the best player available by tiers, for example, elite, high-end ones, etc., that we saw earlier, so that we have a bigger sample size. First, let's look at wide receivers in yellow. This chart suggests you ideally want to take a wide receiver early because their relative value drops off quite a bit, starting in the early second round on average. By the end of the second round, wide receivers have a lower expected value than quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends. Running backs, marked as red on this chart, clearly offer great value from the first pick until the end of the third round. So, the sweet spot for early round running back value is approximately the mid to late second round until the end of the third round, where there's another big tier break. Next is quarterback in blue. They theoretically offer a ton of value even in the first round, but you can usually wait until the late third round or early fourth round and still get an elite option before the pickings get a lot worse on average. Last, we have tight ends, which are in green. Even the elite tier are clearly a bad value option in early rounds compared to the other positions we just discussed. The data suggests that tight ends start to make sense at price, starting around pick 40, aka the mid-4th round, to about 64, mid-7th round. After that point, they're arguably worse than taking a defense or kicker in terms of expected value on average. After the early rounds, it's best to pick a variety of running backs and receivers that you think are promising. To optimize value, what's most important is to keep tabs on how many of each position have been taken in the draft at that point, since doing so will allow you to maximize your expected value. And that's basically it for the video. Let's recap with the executive summary. Running backs clearly offer the best returns at price, even factoring in risk. However, high uncertainty and availability of high-quality options later in drafts suggests that it is optimal to take several early round to mid-round swings on running back rather than going all in on a first rounder. My analysis suggests that wide receivers are somewhat overrated in today's meta, particularly once the truly elite tier is off the board. The data suggests that it's usually optimal to select 1 to 2 wide receivers very early while you can still get the elite ones, and then pepper in a few others at price later in drafts. Quarterbacks are clearly undervalued and offer similar upside to elite wide receivers at cheaper draft capital prices, whilst also being easier to project for the entire season. Therefore, elite quarterbacks should be prioritized in the 3rd to 4th round. And I wouldn't call you crazy if you decided to reach in the 2nd round either. Elite tight ends options are probably overvalued in the post-Travis Kelce era. They can be worth it to invest in if a premium option is available in the 4th or 5th round, but otherwise you're probably better off waiting for a mid-tier option later in drafts. The experts are generally right that it's not worth investing in kickers or defenses until the very last 2 rounds, although you wouldn't be crazy to go for an elite defense or an elite kicker in the 13th round or something. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. And if you enjoy me bringing a consulting framework to an argument I would normally have with my friends at the bar, then you should consider leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers.